movements are what we need the media to cover. Honestly, accurately, bringing out the voices of people at the grassroots. And I want to talk about a few of these movements, but first talk about what happened during these conventions that have just passed, the Republican and Democratic conventions. We were in Tampa covering the Republicans, and the first day, Mike Burke, our senior producer, well, I should say we didn't know if the convention would be canceled because there was going to be this Hurricane Isaac, and so we were watching this very carefully. And Steve Martinez, our video producer, when he heard I was saying, this hurricane might cancel it, he said, "You think it's a legitimate hurricane?" He's referring to Todd Akin, the Missouri congressman who's running to unseat Claire McCaskill, who the Republicans had great hope in could change the balance of the Senate and perhaps give the Senate over to the Republicans. And then he has this interview with a local reporter and says that women who are legitimately raped don't get pregnant. I didn't say Dr. Akin, I said Congressman Akin. And so when Julie Crosby heard Steve say this, Julie is our general manager, she said, well, if it is a legitimate hurricane, not to worry because Tampa will just shut down and won't allow any water in. So anyway, we headed down to Tampa, and the first day, Mike Burke, our senior producer, and Hani Massoud, who leaps tall buildings in a single bound, our video producer, are walking the halls of the corporate suites. It's our job as reporters to follow the money. And they bump into Sheldon Adelson. And you know who he is. He is the Vegas and Macau casino magnate who promises to give something like $100 million in this campaign. He's been investigated for bribery and corruption for the casinos in Macau and all that. And Mike went to ask him, how much do you plan to spend in this election? This is very important. It's the first post-Citizens United election in our country's history. I was speaking about this in Nevada City the other night, and someone said, we shouldn't call it Citizens United. We should call it Corporations United. And what it means is that billions of dollars will be spent in this election by the Republicans and the Democrats. Billions, and we're not going to know where the money comes from. And so when Mike goes to ask Mr. Adelson this question, there's a woman standing between Adelson and Mike, and she steps back and body slams Mike. And she knocks him off his balance. And Hani, very strong guy, he played on the equivalent of the Egyptian national basketball team. He is filming, and she grabs his camera and races into Adelson's suite. And so Hani puts his foot in the door jamb so that she can't close the door, and she takes the camera and slams it on the ground. So Mike is now fidgeting for his Android phone to try to document. They now have nothing to document what's going on. A lot of Adelson folks around, and they are grabbing out of his hand his phone. I mean, I thought if nothing else, Mr. Adelson respects private property, maybe even worships it. But here they're trying to take Mike's. And then a top spokesperson for the casino comes out, hands Mike his card and says, call me tomorrow, I'll make you whole. We'll take care of this, financially. We'll just, whatever you want. And Mike's saying, what are you talking about? Who was that woman? And he said, that would be Sheldon Adelson's daughter. And then she comes out and apologizes twice for what she's done. Now, this kerfuffle between Democracy Now! And the Adelson family, when the Adelson family assaulted the Democracy Now! Reporters, starts to get big, and the New York Times writes about it in Politico. Even Glenn Beck had it accurately on his website. So the Adelsons felt they had to deal with it, and they put out a press release the next day. I mean, they knew they could not say anything that we had started anything here. We had the videotape, and so many people were standing around. I mean, Gingrich had come to pay homage to Adelson. Karl Rove was coming. I mean, it was a big hallway where, these are the corporate suites. There's a lot of activity here. And so they put out this press release that says, they are nothing if not well lawyered up and careful in what they say. We believe reporters should be nonviolent. We also believe this. And they wished us well in covering the rest of the Republican convention. So the next day, I am on the floor of the convention, and I spot David Koch. He is a New York delegate. David and Charles Koch are the billionaire oil and gas magnates who fund the Tea Party. and who promised to give something like $400 million in this election, just following the money. Now, if this were the convention floor, you guys are New Hampshire, you're Wisconsin, you're Governor Walker, he was sitting on the corner. Orrin Hatch is over there, that's Utah, and that's New York. And so I go over to the New York delegation with our video producer, with John Hamilton, and I go to ask Mr. Koch. I see him sitting with other delegates. So I reach over my mic and I say, Mr. Koch, are you concerned that unchecked concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? And all the delegates around him stand up, like they spring up like a stand of aspens within seconds to protect him from this question, and he remains sitting. We tried to get a photo from our video afterwards because, John is tall and he's sort of filming over all these people who stood up. And David Koch is a towering figure, but he's cowering behind all of the other delegates. So the only thing we have on the website, the photo of him, was one eye looking up. And so I asked the guy next to him, who's on the aisle, who immediately stood up to protect him, and it was Ed Cox. He's the longtime chair of the Republican Party of New York. He's the son-in-law of Richard Nixon, married Tricia Nixon Cox. And I said to him, are you concerned that unchecked concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? And he said no. So then the last night of the convention, me and John are over in New Hampshire talking to people. And there's a lot of buzz who's going to be the mystery guest. And all of a sudden, Clint Eastwood comes out on the stage, and he's got this empty chair, and he starts to talk to an invisible Obama. And the racism implicit in this, right? The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And then he goes on to say that critics say that President Obama said he would close Guantanamo. It's been years. He hasn't. Now, that's a very fair criticism. I just didn't expect to hear it from the stage of the Republican convention. And then he went on to say that President Obama has presided over the longest war in U.S. history, Afghanistan. True. Another fair criticism. And he said something about Mitt Romney would pull the troops out the next morning. I think there was no one more surprised to hear this than Mitt Romney. And then Mitt Romney comes out. This is the biggest moment of his political life. And he doesn't come out on the stage. He comes out down an aisle. You can't see. There's thousands of people. We're over there in New Hampshire, so we're only looking up on the Jumbotron. We see the music is swelling. He's coming out. He's shaking hands. But I recognize the aisle. There's many aisles, but I know this aisle. I have walked it for 3 days now. This is the aisle of the New York delegation, right? I recognize Senator Hatch's sneakers. I see the back of Mr. Walker's head, the whole thing, Governor Walker's head. So I go, oh, my God, John, start filming the Jumbotron. And John says, why? We'll get the pool feed. We're reporters, and you get this pool feed at the end of the night. And in New York, Robbie Karen, our video producer, will take it, and anything we want, we'll get. And he said, let's do original reporting, entries. I said, you never know what we're going to get. Film the Jumbotron. He's coming up to the New York delegation. I'm sure he's going to shake Mr. Koch's hand. Or, it's important to have this when we talk about their relationship. And so we see he's walking down. There's this big pole that says New York. He's coming up to that area where I was questioning him. And there, now Mr. Koch is standing up, as is Mr. Cox, and Romney's coming down, and he stops at David Koch, and he shakes his hand, puts his arm on him, he points at him, and he moves on. Okay, so it's not that much of a surprise. He's a massive donor to the campaign and to the Republican Party, but, then he makes his way down. He gives his speech. It's the end of the night and the end of the convention, and I call Robbie, and I say, okay, just pull the video on the pool feed of Romney talking to Mr. Koch. And he said, what video? I said, no. I said, don't tell me they just showed the stage when he got there. He said, no, they show Mr. Romney coming down the aisle. I said, okay, so you probably don't recognize David Koch. He hasn't been a really out front public figure until recently. They've gotten much more assertive and aggressive in their involvement in politics, David and Charles Koch. So you probably don't recognize him. He's this sort of towering figure. He said, I do recognize him, but it's not there. He said, I see Governor Romney walking down, shaking people's hands. He comes to the New York delegation, but then the video cuts away. You see these two young, energetic women. They've got red, white, and blue feather boas wrapped around their necks, and they're dancing. And then it shows a overview of the whole convention floor. And then it goes back to him shaking hands further down with the New York delegation. Then he walks up on the stage and gives his speech. And so we have him send this video to us through the internet, and we make a split screen. of what actually happened on the convention floor that night and what the rest of the world saw, the pool feed. I even called Reuters, because we get it from Reuters. I said, who edited that Romney walking down the aisle? And they said, oh, well, the pool feed, it was NBC who was responsible for it tonight, because each night a different network then has to get handed out to all the reporters. But I'm not even saying NBC did it, because they might have been hooked into a box and getting it perhaps from the RNC that was directing the show. And I'm not even saying this wasn't that this was purely coincidental. It could have been. All I'm saying is that if you tuned into Democracy Now! The next day, you saw something that you saw nowhere else, except all the networks then picked up the Koch-Romney handshake and showed that split screen. We call this trickle-up journalism. And speaking of the Koch-Romney handshake, there's an interesting story. I was, the day before the convention, I was in Tampa, and Michael Kranish spoke. He's a Boston Globe reporter who wrote the biography of Mitt Romney. He told an interesting story. You know, Mitt Romney's father was Governor George Romney, and he was a very popular Michigan governor. He couldn't even decide whether to run as a Democrat or Republican, but he decided to run as a Republican after 2 years, very popular, and the Republican Party wanted to draft him to run for president, or some people within the Republican Party did. And so he went to the convention deciding whether to challenge Goldwater. He really despised everything that Goldwater represented. He was horrified that he didn't support civil rights and the Voting Rights Act. And he decided not to run. He brought Mitt Romney with him, who was in high school at the time. But he gave a major address to the Republican Platform Committee. And in that address, Governor George Romney decried hate and extremism and said it's going to destroy our party. And he particularly singled out the John Birch Society, you know, that racist, segregationist organization that fought King and fought civil rights and was founded actually in Wisconsin. You know that the John Birch Society was co-founded by the father of Charles and David Koch, named Fred Koch. So it's just interesting that here you have a generation later, the sons of the co-founder of the John Birch Society shaking hands with the son of Governor George Romney, who had so warned the Republican Party against hate and extremism. And now Mitt Romney is being funded by and shaking hands with the Kochs. History is important. It gives us a sense of where we are, where we need to be. We then moved on from the Republican convention to the Democratic convention in Charlotte, a civil rights rich history Charlotte has. I mean, 1960, you know, the Woolworth's lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro inspired the students at Johnson C. Smith Historically Black College in Charlotte to march on their own lunch counters, and, you know, very brave in what they did to integrate those lunch counters. So the first day of the Republican convention, it was raining outside, and I got a text, something's going to happen on a corner right about the time that the Democratic convention is gavelled inside, but this is going to happen outside. It's often more interesting to be outside. So we race over to this corner. It's right near the gates to the convention, and this bus covered with butterflies pulls up. It's the Undocubus. You know, this is the bus with undocumented immigrants that's come from Phoenix and made its way to Charlotte to demand that the Democratic Party support the DREAM Act. It started with the young people who were sitting in on President Obama's campaign offices and other senators and Congress members' campaign offices who were risking so much. These young, undocumented students weren't only risking arrest, they were risking deportation. And they humiliated Obama. He understood their power. I mean, he was a community organizer, right? And so this summer, he conceded, and he announced a kind of executive order that said that undocumented immigrants 30 years old or younger who meet certain criteria could have a 2-year reprieve from deportation, could go to school, could work legally. Okay, they can't get health care, but they could do these other things. But these young dreamers won't stop. They want the DREAM Act passed. They want a lot. They want a compassionate, humane immigration policy passed in this country. And this Undocubus was filled not only with them, but with their parents. And they meant business. And they were coming to Charlotte. And they started to stream out of this bus. They started chanting, "No papers, no fear. No papers, no fear." I saw Rosie Karaskow. We'd actually interviewed her on Democracy Now! That morning. It's always interesting to watch Democracy Now! You never know what these guests are going to do. And so she comes out of the bus, and she's followed by her husband, Martin Nzueta. And she and her husband and their daughter were going to get arrested. And Martin Nzueta comes out of the bus and says, "I've paid taxes in this country for 18 years, which is more than Citibank can say." And I'm interviewing Rosie. And then a well-known, you really can't call them journalists, media personality comes up to me, who I'd known from various panels and stuff. And he said, "Hey, Amy, what are these guys doing? What's happening here?" Because he sees the police are moving in. You know, the rain is pouring down. The police are pouring in. And I said, "I think they're about to get arrested." He said, "Well, what are they saying?" And I'm interviewing Rosie. So I said, "Well, why don't you ask her?" And so he said, "Well, you just tell me. What is it that they want?" So I said, "Rosie, could you tell this gentleman what it is you want?" And she said, "I want to know what kind of legacy President Obama wants to leave." She said, "I want to know if he wants to be remembered as the president who deported more immigrants than any president in U.S. history, or does he want to be on the side of the immigrants?" That was pretty eloquent. And he starts writing it down in his reporter's notebook. Why is it so hard for them to talk directly to people at the target end of policy? I mean, this small circle of pundits who we see on all the networks, who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. So then they start to march, and they're marching down the street, and they get to the gates of the convention. They unfurl this banner that has a big butterfly on it, and there's one young woman who's got her arm wrapped around an older woman who's much smaller, and she's sitting down on the banner. And I say to her, "I bet you probably fit the criteria that has just been passed, the deferred action plan of President Obama, that you could probably stay. You would qualify, right?" And she said, "Yes, I would." But she said, "My mother wouldn't. And if she is deported, I might as well go with her." And then I asked another young woman who was kneeling, her head was bowed, she was about to get arrested. And I asked her, "Why the butterflies, on the banner, on the bus?" And she said, "Oh, because butterflies know no borders. Butterflies are free." And with that, 10 of them got arrested. The police poured in, put them into the police wagon, and they were taken away. These are the movements that make this country great. And I want to address an issue that I've become increasingly concerned about when I talk about the police pouring in. It's the militarization of police and the crackdown on dissent in this country. Under President Obama, a very alarming figure is the number of whistleblowers the Obama administration has gone after, charging them with espionage. More whistleblowers charged with espionage than under all other presidential administrations combined. We have a law in this country called the Posse Comitatus Act, which I think most people agree with, which just says that it's not a good thing to have U.S. soldiers marching through the streets of this country. And I think the way the authorities are getting around this is by militarizing the police. And we're not just talking about riot police anymore. I mean, they are fully militarized. Since 9/11, local police departments have gotten billions of dollars in tanks, drones. These are local police departments. The level of surveillance is unprecedented. Big story just came out of Boston, the infiltration of the peace movement and church groups in Boston for years. This is just this past week the news came out. AP just won the Pulitzer Prize for their series on one police department, not really mine, but the New York Police Department. And what they've been doing over the last years, monitoring thousands of Arab Americans and Muslims. These are peaceful, law-abiding citizens of this country. They are moving in, these police agents, and doing what's called mosque crawling. They are going beyond New York's borders. It's bad enough in New York. They're going to New Jersey, Connecticut. The president of Yale University issued a statement saying, this is an outrage. How dare the New York police come to Connecticut and monitor our students? New Jersey officials saying the same thing. A New Jersey landlord was one of the first to discover this. In one of his apartments, he found all this surveillance equipment. And he was really alarmed, and he called the police. But the problem was, it was the police. We had on a student from CUNY, the City University of New York. He was named in the documents that AP had gotten under the Freedom of Information Act. And he was on a camping trip one weekend, and this is what was in the documents. His parents did not want him to do any media. They said, we don't want to be targeted. You know, people feel under so much siege. And he said, we're already targeted. My name is there. He said, our only defense is if we speak out. So he came on the show. And he said, it must have been the driver who took them on their camping trip. You know, it's a really good thing when kids don't want to just be in little cliques. When someone, you know, they make a new friend and they say, why don't you come along? So it turns out it was probably the driver, the one kid that they didn't know as well. And every detail of their camping trip was listed, every detail. And it said that these students were so extreme that they prayed 4 times a day. He said this infiltrator was so stupid, he didn't know we pray 5 times a day. But this is very serious. You know, I was just on one of the networks, and the reporter said to me, well, I mean, it's all well and good what you're saying, but we have to get real. You know, after September 11th, we have to be very concerned, and there are some things that just have to be compromised so that we can ensure our security. And I said, well, if we had a universal standard of justice, maybe you're right. You know, you got to just take care of things, and there's some things that have to be compromised. But if that were true, how come after Timothy McVeigh was caught and convicted for blowing up the Oklahoma City building, why didn't the police throughout this country monitor every white Christian community? No, we know that. And if you're going to make the argument this increases national security, it's the opposite. When a community feels under siege, they close in on themselves. And when they see a problem in their communities, the last ones they're going to go to are the people that are targeting them. This doesn't help anyone, but it certainly increases racial profiling and prejudice. And then I want to talk about the movements and talk about the militarization of police with those movements. I mean, this last year, where do you begin? Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi comes out of university. He goes into the marketplace, has no opportunity, starts to sell fruit and vegetables in the marketplace. The authorities harass him, take his scale. He's so frustrated, he sets himself on fire, and this sparks the Tunisian revolution. It sparks a generation, a nation of frustration. Something else, by the way, I think sparked the Tunisian revolution, and that was WikiLeaks, the whistleblower website that, that has put out millions of documents, whether they're on the Iraq war logs, Afghan war logs, State Department cables, and in those State Department cables that had just recently come out at the time of the Tunisian revolution, it showed that, Ben Ali, the dictator, was corrupt and brutal. And it wasn't as if the people of Tunisia didn't know that. But what the document showed is that the U.S. government knew that, but it still continued to fund him to the tune of millions of dollars every single year. And it just enraged the population. And then that sparked the Egyptian revolution. And how many of you experienced the Egyptian revolution through the reporting of Sharif Abdel-Qaddous, our senior producer? Who did such an amazing job. Sharif is an Egyptian American, and when January 2011 came along, and he started getting texts from family and friends saying, "I'll die for my country," he was shocked. Like he said, these were apolitical people that he knew, and he knew something was changing in his country. So he flew directly into Tahrir, basically. Okay, he flew into Cairo and went to Tahrir, but, I mean, this was the time when Mubarak plunged Egypt into digital darkness, right? He shut off the internet. Actually, he couldn't do it himself. He used a U.S. company based here in California called Naras. They did it. And when there was global outcry, they put out this press release because they were embarrassed. And they said something like, we were only following orders. We've heard that before. So the internet's down. And Sharif becomes one of the top tweeters in the world because he figured out a way around it. You know, democracy now, we always have relied on the internet and figuring ways around things because necessity is the mother of invention. We use the internet from, 16 years ago when we started to send broadcast quality radio shows so that stations could pick up the show and that people could listen to it. And then when we began the week of September 11th to broadcast on television, we pioneered a way to send broadcast quality video through the internet to stations all over the country and around the world because we couldn't afford the satellites at the time. You know, we have to preserve an open and free internet. The telecoms and the cable companies want to write the legislation that would privatize the internet. It is a global resource that we all must protect and keep it open and free. So Sharif becomes a top tweeter in the world, and then, the internet goes back up, but the thugs take down the satellites. They break into the international and U.S., media offices, and they really break apart the satellites. And then you see people like Anderson Cooper in his hotel room on a kind of old-fashioned Democracy Now! Look, the sort of fuzzy Skype, and the lower third says, reporting from an undisclosed location. And here was Sharif in Tahrir, broadcasting exactly where he was, saying it was the safest place to be in Egypt, and saying who he was. And he was with Hani Massoud. Hani, who leaps tall buildings in a single bound, was played on like the Egyptian national basketball team. He was his video producer. You want him at your side in times of trouble. And these were the reports that you were seeing. You saw Sharif interviewing Adef Souef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love. You saw him interviewing Nawal Saadawi, the 79-year-old feminist, former presidential candidate in Egypt, wrote so many books, was a psychiatrist, was imprisoned under Sadat, who was exiled under Mubarak. And she was holding salons even before Tahrir because the young people were so disgruntled and disillusioned. And she was saying, we will win, we will win. And you saw, the high school student putting out a broadsheet called Voices of Tahrir in the shadow of the state media building that had spewed lies for so long. Sharif would do these interviews. Hani would take the video, and he would jump over the burning barricades and make his way around the camels who were brought in to trounce the protesters and make his way back to Sharif's family's house. Sharif, as I was saying, comes from a very illustrious family. His grandfather's the most famous writer of Egypt, Hassan Abdel-Qaddus. And so Hani would go to Sharif's house, and he would put together these 20, 25-minute reports, send them through the internet at night with the satellites down, and we would broadcast them the next day. And Sharif would be interviewed by NBC and MSNBC and CNN every hour through this period leading up to Mubarak's ouster. Again, we call this trickle-up journalism. And then we move from Egypt to the Arab Spring to Wisconsin, the largest protests Wisconsin has ever seen. Inspired, I think, partly by the Arab Spring and maybe partly by Governor Scott Walker. But we flew into Madison, the state capital, because we cover grassroots movements, and this one was remarkable. They took over the Capitol building. I went in the Capitol building. I saw some of the biggest guys I've ever seen, the Oshkosh prison guards. And I went up to them and I said, well, who did you vote for in the last election? They said, Governor Walker, of course. So I said, so what are you doing here? Protesting Governor Walker, of course. I said, why? Because he didn't tell us he was going to go after the teachers, our wives, our neighbors, our community. And then I went outside, 150,000 people marching against Walker. And there was one guy with spectacles, old guy with glasses on, holding a sign as he walked, IRS auditors against Walker. And especially for young people here, if you think it's all very clear-cut years ago, good and bad, good and evil, when Dr. King was marching and organizing, very straightforward. Segregation is bad. Equality is a good thing, but it's a little grayer now. I think you should think again. I mean, the continuum is there. 1932, Wisconsin, AFSCME was founded, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. I mean, the John Birch Society was also founded in Appleton, Wisconsin, but AFSCME. When did Dr. King die? He was assassinated April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. He'd simply gone to Memphis to march with the sanitation workers who were trying to organize Local 1707 of AFSCME. It's a continuum. And then we move from Wisconsin to, like the end of August to September. You had thousands of people making a ring around the Rose Garden in Washington, D.C., trying to get President Obama to stop the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline, bringing tar sands oil from Alberta to the Gulf of Mexico, and 1,200 people got arrested. And then people moved on up to New York, and then there was Occupy, September 17th, 2011. Occupy. The media, corporate media, didn't touch it for a week. Just did not talk about it. I mean, they're in the media metropolis of the world, the Occupy encampment right off Wall Street, and the media doesn't talk about it. Of course, we were covering it before. We were talking to activists on the ground who were talking about what they were going to be doing. But then a week after, not talking about it. So then I see on one of the network morning shows, they're saying they have to say something. So they start to ridicule it. They say, if these people could get it together to figure out what it is that they want, maybe we would have their spokesperson in our studios. But they don't even have a spokesperson. That's part of their problem. And these signs, there's nothing, everyone has a different sign, they said. They have no message. What are they trying to say? And I thought, my God, any Madison Avenue PR executive would drool to be the one to be credited with perhaps the most successful slogan in U.S. history. We are the 99%. That is something that resonated across this country. Whether you agree with it or not, you understood exactly what the message is. And Occupy, the word occupies the language now, and occupies many languages all over the world. You know, I think Mahatma Gandhi said it best. First, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you. Then you win. And I want to talk about the pizza, right? You know, the pizza pies that were flying into Zuccotti Park because you had the Egyptians calling up and putting in orders to the local pizzerias saying, send them to the occupiers. You had Wisconsinites calling up the local pizzerias in New York, send them to the occupiers. And so there were so many pizza pies coming into Zuccotti Park. Of course, the occupiers called them occupies. And they are, if not conservationist, and they were using every aspect. They were eating the pies, but they couldn't eat. I mean, there were so many of them. They had these huge buffets, and hundreds of people would line up for these buffets. You know, this is right next to Wall Street. I saw bankers on the line. They heard there was a free lunch, you know. So... and then they used the boxes, the box tops, to make signs. And they were very good. I mean, there was this freak snowstorm in October, another reason, you know, climate change, which hasn't been raised in the presidential debates yet, once, climate change. This freak snowstorm, everyone goes under the tarps, and they pull in all their signs except for one that says, hell, snow, we won't go. And they had other signs, too, like, I'll believe a corporation is a person when Texas executes one. And which brings me to some other signs that people carried as they marched on Zuccotti Park on September 17th. I am Troy Davis, and too much doubt. Many people were carrying those signs. We flew from Zuccotti Park September 17th, a few days later, September 21st, 7 o'clock. Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. If we could have been broadcasting from the execution chamber, we would have been. Most people in this country don't realize how alone we are, the only industrialized country in the world to execute, if you will, the death penalty. We have to show what's done in our name. Well, we couldn't get into the execution chamber, but being on the grounds, at least we would do that. And I know this is particularly relevant with the ballot initiative that's being considered right now in California. But it is so important, whatever side you take, that we know what's at stake, that we know how unusual the United States is in this. And so we flew down, and we were on the prison grounds. And I want to just read an excerpt of a column that we wrote. On September 21st at 7 p.m., Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. We were reporting live from outside Georgia's death row in Jackson, awaiting news about whether the Supreme Court would spare his life. Troy Davis was sentenced to death for the murder of off-duty Savannah police officer Mark McPhail in 1989. Officer McPhail was a hero cop. He was moonlighting for Burger King. It was late at night, and a homeless man was being pistol-whipped in a parking lot, and he went to his aid, and Officer McPhail was shot dead, and whoever shot him should be seriously punished. The question was, who shot him? 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses in Troy Davis's trial later recanted or changed their testimony, some alleging police intimidation for their original false statements. One who did not recant was the man who many have named as the actual killer. His name is Sylvester Red Coles. He went with a lawyer soon after the shooting to the police station in Savannah and pointed the finger at Troy Davis. No physical evidence linked Davis to the shooting. Davis was one of more than 3,200 prisoners on death row in the United States. He'd faced 3 prior execution dates. With each one, global awareness grew. The NAACP took up his case. Amnesty International took up his case. Calls for clemency came from the Pope, came from the former FBI Director William Sessions, came from the former Republican Congressmember from Georgia, Bob Barr, came from Alan Alt, the former death row prison warden of this prison, and other prison wardens. They aren't against the death penalty, but they said in the case of Troy Davis, too much doubt. When we came on the grounds, I was with Hani Massoud, who you want to be with in times of difficult reporting. I was with Renee Feltz, our reporter who comes from Texas and is well known for covering death row cases, and with Mike Burke, who would later be body slammed by the Adelson family. We came on the grounds, and the Department of Corrections gave us the press packet. It was very thin, but it did have a page talking about the schedule that Troy Davis would follow for the last day of his life. It said that from 9 to 3 he could see his family, but then they'd have to clear out for a routine physical. Routine physical? You know that a while ago in Texas, a man on death row attempted suicide. They raced him to the hospital. They got him better, and then they executed him. Now, on the grounds of the prison, the Department of Corrections said we could not go near the protest pen, which is where we wanted to broadcast from. That's where 150 people were allowed to be. That's where the family of Troy Davis was, the heads of human rights organizations, people from all over the world. And then 1,000 people were across the street from the historically black colleges, Spelman and Morehouse College. They were all holding candles. They had come from Atlanta. The elite journalists were on the edge of the grounds of the prison because the authorities said they couldn't go near the protest pen. And I couldn't believe they weren't pushing back at all. I mean, we were going to be broadcasting for hours. I didn't plan to just speak that entire time. The point is to go to where the silence is, to go to the people who are rarely heard and talk to them. So why weren't these journalists pushing back? Well, they would probably be on for 30 or 60 seconds. It's not that hard to fill that amount of time. But then our satellite truck came. You know, it pays to work with the big boys sometimes, the ones that are bigger than the Oshkosh prison guards when you have some serious work to do. You know, we got the truck that Fox would get the next day and CNN would get the following week, and that satellite truck came on the grounds right at the point when the Department of Corrections said that I had to step back. And they pull up, they pull down their windows, and they says, "Miss Goodman, where do you want the truck?" And I'm looking nervously at the guards, and I said, well, they are saying that they said, "You're paying for the truck, where do you want it?" So I said, oh, well, I was actually thinking of if there was at all possible that I might go right over there to the protest pen. This truck barreled over to the protest pen. And when these guards on the ground saw these cameramen in the truck, they step back and they get out of the truck and they've got their big cameras and they say to me, "Where do you want to stand next to the rope?" And I'm looking over at the guards, and they've got these big orange cones, the satellite truck drivers, and they're staking it. They said, "Where do you want to report?" I said, "Well, I was thinking right up against the rope." They hand me the microphone. They say, "Start talking." And so we began our broadcast at 6 o'clock. We talked about the schedule that Troy Davis would be following that day. And then also in the press packet was in great detail what Troy Davis would be having for dinner. Troy Davis had turned down the special meal. The press kit described the standard tray he would be offered: grilled cheeseburgers, oven brown potatoes, baked beans, coleslaws, cookies, and a great beverage. It also listed the lethal cocktail that would follow on a separate page, like when you go to the eye doctor and they're checking your vision. 4 lines, big letters. The first line, pentobarbital, then pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, and the final line, Ativan, in parentheses, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, the potassium chloride stops the heart. Davis refused the sedative and the Last Supper. By 7 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Thomas hails from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves that's near Savannah, where Davis had lived. The Supreme Court denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53 p.m. A prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside. Time of death, 11:08 p.m. The eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. You know how the execution protocol works. The prisoner is strapped down to a cross-like gurney. At the last minute, curtains are pulled back on a glass, and the audience then can be seen by the prisoner, and vice versa. It's the family of the murder victim. It's the people that the prisoner asks to come. Maybe some will be there. And then there's the reporters. The reporters stepped out on the grounds of the prison. According to the Associated Press reporter who was there, these were Troy Davis's final words. He said, "I'd like to address the McPhail family, let you know I'm not the one who killed your son, your father, your brother. I'm innocent. I did not have a gun. All I can ask is that you look deeper into this case so that you really can finally see the truth. I ask my family and friends to continue to fight the fight. For those about to take my life," he said to his executioners, "God have mercy on your souls. God bless your souls." The state of Georgia took Davis's body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. On Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As I stood on the grounds of the prison just after Troy Davis was executed, the Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. I was reminded what Gandhi reportedly answered when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He responded, "I think it would be a good idea." That was one of the movements that fueled Occupy as well. And the crackdown in all of these cases on Occupy, the largest mass arrest in U.S. history, some 700-800 people were arrested right after the encampment started. And then the violence that meets peaceful protesters, that is increasing. You don't have to take it from me. Take it from Norm Stamper, who is the former police chief of Seattle. Remember the Battle of Seattle in 1999 when thousands of people marched in Seattle to protest the World Trade Organization, this supranational organization that actually relates to California, right, that can overturn the laws of democratically elected legislatures. You have this ballot initiative calling for GMO labeling. That's a perfect example. If by chance it passes, another country could file a complaint with the World Trade Organization that says California has introduced a barrier to trade, an obstacle to trade, and call it WTO illegal. And then the WTO can overturn the laws of these democratically elected legislatures. And people understood this in 1999, and French farmers were out there, environmentalists were out there, unionists were out there, high school kids and their teachers were out there. Massive protest against the WTO. And Norm Stamper, the police chief of Seattle, tried to stamp out all dissent. He moved in on these peaceful protesters with so much force. Within a day, the police had to go to other states to find pepper spray and tear gas, more of it, because he'd used it up almost immediately. We're talking about police not only having, the face masks, but full body shields, not just face shields. They move in on you like a wall these days. And it's not only like a wall, that's if you're lucky. They use dogs, they use horses. But in the case of the WTO, Stamper tried to stamp out all dissent. I mean, hundreds of people were arrested. People were picking up the rubber bullets that he was having shot at the protesters. He now says it was the worst mistake of his life. He is one of the chief spokespeople against the militarization of police. He says, we create a wall with our police that prevents the police from seeing these peaceful protesters as their daughters, as their neighbors, as their teachers, their grandmothers, as the people that they are. It's interesting, we had Chief Stamper on with the spokesperson for the Police Foundation not so long ago, who had organized a conference call between 18 police chiefs on how to eviscerate the Occupy movement. And when the spokesperson came on, he first said, I just want to say what an honor it is to be on Democracy Now! With Chief Stamper, because we really see you as the model. And Chief Stamper said, me as the model for what I did during the Battle of Seattle? He said, I'm the opposite. I should not be seen as the model. This is the terrible mistake that I have made. And certainly with UC Davis, students protesting budget cuts and get pepper sprayed in the face at point-blank range, now winning, like $30,000 per student for those that were hit with the pepper spray. And this is happening all over the country. We had our own experience, not at this convention, but at the 2008 convention. I might have described it here before, but just very briefly. First day of the Republican convention in St. Paul. We'd come from Denver. There was mass protest there. There was mass protest at the Palin McCain convention. It was before the convention started. It was the morning 10,000 people March for Peace from the St. Paul City Hall to the Excel Center. We were covering the protests, led by soldiers who were refusing to go to war or had gone and didn't want to go back or were going back but felt it was wrong, and thousands of civilians. And then I went off to the convention floor to interview delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska. And my colleagues, Sharif Abdel-Qaddous and Nicole Salazar, went back to the TV studio to digitize tape, and I'm on the floor of the convention, and I get a call from Mike Burke, and he says, go quickly to 7th and Jackson. Sharif and Nicole have been bloodied and beaten and arrested by the police. I said, what are you talking about? It's this beautiful blue sky day. It's Labor Day. They're in the TV station. He said, get to 7th and Jackson. So I race off the convention floor. I find my way to 7th and Jackson. Now, I am wearing the police-recognized credentials, top security credentials that allow me to interview presidents, vice presidents, delegates. I've clearly come from the convention floor. Riot police have surrounded this whole area of this corner I was supposed to go to. And I go up to one of them, and I said, I've just come from the convention floor. You can see my credentials. My colleagues, 2 reporters are inside. They've been arrested. They have the same credentials I do. I'd like to speak to a commanding officer. We need to have them released now. It wasn't seconds before the police ripped me through the police line, twisted my arms back, slacked the handcuffs on, threw me up against a car, then against a wall, onto the ground, charging me with a misdemeanor, interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. And I'm looking from my vantage point on the ground for Sharif and Nicole. I still can't find them, but then I see Sharif across the parking lot. I see his arms are behind his back. I demand to be brought to him. Finally, the police bring me to him. We're both standing there demanding to be released, whereupon the Secret Service came and ripped the credentials from around our necks. Then I'm brought into the police van. There's Nicole. Well, Sharif's arm was bleeding. Nicole's face was bleeding. I said, Nicole, what happened? I left you. You were going into the TV station. She said, we were. We were in the station, and then we heard a commotion. I grabbed the camera. Sharif grabbed the mic. We raced outside. They wouldn't have been doing their jobs if they hadn't gone outside. And they came to this parking lot. There were protesters. There were riot police. She was up against a car. She was filming, and this phalanx of riot police started to come at her. She hadn't planned to film her own violent arrest. But the police, as they came at her, started shouting, on your face, whatever that means. And she is shouting back at them, press, press, and she's holding up her press pass. And they took her down. She did not know what hit her. From behind and from in front of her, they took her down on her face. They put knee or boot in her back. They were pulling on her legs, so they're dragging her face through the gravel. Her camera had tumbled down. The first thing they did was pull the battery out of her camera. If you were wondering what it was, they wanted to stop happening. So Sharif is a very cool guy, right? He doesn't get arrested in Mubarak's Egypt, right, covering the protests there. But he gets arrested in the streets of the United States, covering what's supposed to be a celebration of democracy. He goes up to the riot police, and he tells them to calm down. They take him, they throw him up against the wall, kick him twice in the chest, bloodying his arm, and they take him down. Sharif and Nicole face PC felony riot charges. That's probable cause felony riot. So I'm taken to the police garage where they've erected cages to put the protesters in. Sharif and Nicole are taken to jail. The video of our arrest went online within a half an hour. It went viral. It was the most watched YouTube video of the first 2 days of convention. And this shows when media activism, activism is liberating. It definitely liberated us. Thousands of people called in, faxed in, tweeted in, emailed in to the Twin City authorities, and after a number of hours, I was released. And then Sharif and Nicole. Sharif was in jail with the AP photographer. They arrested more than 40 reporters that week. And Sharif gets out before the AP photographer. So then I'm taken to the convention center. The convention's over that night, but the networks want to interview me. Like, what happened? This is the first night of the convention, and I'm in the NBC skybox. And at the end of the interview, NBC reporter comes up to me and says, I don't get it. Why wasn't I arrested? And I said, oh, were you outside covering the protests too? And he said, no. And so I said, well, I don't get arrested in the skybox either. Like Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. You've got to get out there. It's our job to be on the convention floor, and it's our job to get into the corporate suites, and we shouldn't get body slammed when we try to do this. And we've got to get out into the streets where the uninvited guests are. Sometimes thousands of them. And they have something important to say as well. Democracy is a messy thing. And we shouldn't have to get a record when we try to put things on the record. So the next day, the police chief holds a news conference, talk about the success of the first day of the police operation. We've just gotten a call out of the emergency room. I go to the news conference, and the officer who opens the door to the news conference was my processing officer the night before. So I said to him, you not only have to let me into this news conference, you have to let me out when it's done. So I go into the news conference, and I raise my hand, and I ask Chief Harrington, well, first I describe what happened to us, and then I said, what have you instructed your officers to do, and how do you expect us to operate in this environment? And he said we could embed with a mobile field force, the police mobile field. We could embed. You know what he means, like embed in the front lines of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. The next day I see a Fox reporter with his Fox baseball cap in the middle of what looked like this moving police organism going down the street. Embed. Now, I'm not saying reporters who embed with troops in Iraq and Afghanistan aren't brave. They are. But I think the embedding process has brought the media to an all-time low. The Pentagon calls it a spectacular success, which is why it's a complete failure. We are supposed to be a part, not a party to these parties. We are supposed to be the check and balance on power. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. What do you think you're going to get when you're embedded with troops in the front lines in war? You're eating with them, you're sleeping with them, your life is in their hands. You're reporting from the trigger end of the war. If you're going to do that, you need reporters embedded in Iraqi hospitals and Afghan communities and the peace movement around the world. And the problem isn't only being embedded with troops, it's being embedded with the establishment in Washington. We must be a part. We must be holding them accountable. It is not a comfortable position to occupy, but that is what we have to do. So we sued the Twin City authorities and the Secret Service. And it took a number of years. Last year, the Minneapolis judge called us back to try to settle the case, and we ultimately did an unprecedented settlement, six-figure settlement. Also, an agreement by the St. Paul police that they would develop a protocol on how they deal with reporters that would then be shared with the Minneapolis police and with the state troopers. And we thought, we have to send a message here that police will have to pay a price when they do this. So where could we hold this news conference where we could address the greatest concentration of police? So we flew back to New York and held the press conference at Occupy Wall Street. We knew there would be many police there, as well as protesters. That it's not only about illegally arresting journalists, but any kind of unlawful arrests. And my brother David and I wrote a couple of books. One was called Exception to the Rulers, but that's important, that phrase, exception to the rulers. That's our job as journalists, and that's the motto of Democracy Now! The second one we called Static, and the reason we call it that is that that's what the media should give us, the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. And so I want to just talk about, in ending this talk, about one person who is, seminal in movement creating, and that was Rosa Parks. I'll tell her story quickly because everyone knows it. But the media gets it wrong, even with Rosa Parks. December 1st, 1955, she sits down the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, refuses to get up for a white passenger, gets arrested, and in so doing, she launches the modern-day civil rights movement. 4 days later, she's in court, December 5th, 55, and the Montgomery Improvement Association has its meeting to choose a leader to lead the bus boycott that will lead to the desegregation of the transportation system, and they choose a minister who just come into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helped to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, when she died, we raced to Washington. She was the first African-American woman to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. They took her body then to a Washington church. Thousands came out. Oprah was inside. Cicely Tyson was inside. And we went outside because that's more often where it's interesting to be. And we were interviewing people. There were loudspeakers for the services to be heard outside. And I interviewed a young woman. I said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, I emailed my professor. I said, "I won't be in class today. I'm going to get an education." And this is where the media got it wrong. I remember CNN saying Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked under E.D. Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics, had worked with A. Philip Randolph to organize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the black conductors on the trains who were so discriminated against. A. Philip Randolph went on to organize the 1963 March on Washington. E.D. Nixon and Rosa Parks had been challenging the racist laws for years. She'd gone to the Highlander Center, trained with black and white together to most effectively strategize to change the laws. Dr. King had been there. The media denigrates activists, but what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? Rosa Parks had sat down in the bus before and refused to get up for a white passenger, as had other young women. You never know when the magic moment will come. But if you're involved with social change, you will help to build a foundation that will determine the future, that will make history. And to show how brave Rosa was, she was deeply affected by what happened just a few months before. It was the summer of 1955, the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy. His mother, Mamie, in Chicago wanted him out of the city for the summer, sent him to be with his aunt and uncle and cousins in Money, Mississippi. And he was ripped out of his bed by a white mob. They said he wolf whistled at a white woman. Mamie had taught her son, Emmett, he was a stutterer, to whistle when he stuttered. He ended up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When his body was dredged up, his mother, Mamie Till, did something incredibly courageous. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands streamed by his casket and saw. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated head. And they were actually published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Could you imagine, on this 11th anniversary of the longest war in U.S. history, Afghanistan, we saw the images of war for just 1 week. Above the fold of every surviving newspaper, a photograph and an article about a baby dead on the ground. The top radio and TV news story of every newscast about a soldier dead and dying. And everyone's Facebook wall, every tweet, every email, a story of a woman with her legs blown off by cluster bombs or a wedding party killed in a drone attack. For just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say no. War is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy Now!